For more than 60 years, the United States and Cuba have been locked in one of the longest running geopolitical conflicts in modern history. Today, Cuba is facing fuel shortages, rolling blackouts, food shortages, medicine shortages, and a worsening economic crisis. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has increased pressure on Cuba through new sanctions and restrictions aimed at cutting off fuel supplies to the island. At the same time, both countries are once again engaged in discussions that could shape the future of Cuba. But how did we get here? How did two countries separated by only 90 miles become enemies, and what happens next? To understand today's crisis, we have to go back to the beginning. Before Fidel Castro came to power, Cuba looked very different. After the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spain lost control of Cuba. Although Cuba became independent, the United States gained enormous influence over the island. American companies invested heavily in sugar, railroads, utilities, hotels, and agriculture. By the 1950s, American businesses controlled large portions of the Cuban economy. Some Cubans viewed this as economic development. Others believed Cuba had become too independent on foreign interests. Those frustrations eventually fueled a revolution. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Cuban leader Fulgencio Batista. Many Cubans welcomed the revolution. They hoped for less corruption, greater independence, and better economic opportunities. Soon after taking power, Castro nationalized industries and seized property owned by wealthy Cubans and foreign companies. Many American-owned assets were taken over by the Cuban government. The United States demanded compensation. Castro refused. Relations between the two countries rapidly deteriorated. One of the most famous figures of the Cuban Revolution was Ernesto Che Guevara. Born in Argentina in 1928, Che was originally trained as a doctor. As a young man, he traveled throughout Latin America and witnessed widespread poverty, inequality, and political instability. These experiences convinced him that major social and economic change was needed throughout the region. In Mexico, Che met Fidel Castro and joined Castro's revolutionary movement. Together, they returned to Cuba and fought against the Batista government. After the revolution succeeded in 1959, Che became one of the most powerful figures in the new Cuban government. He helped oversee economic reforms, land redistribution, and the nationalization of industries. Che strongly believed in socialism and anti-imperialism. He argued that countries throughout Latin America should free themselves from foreign influence and economic domination. Supporters viewed Che as a revolutionary who fought against poverty, corruption, and inequality. Critics point to his role in revolutionary tribunals, political repression, and the imprisonment and execution of opponents after the revolution. Che remains one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century. To some, he is a symbol of resistance and revolution. To others, he represents authoritarianism and political violence. In 1965, Che left Cuba to support revolutionary movements abroad. He later traveled to Bolivia, where he attempted to start another revolution. In 1967, he was captured and executed by Bolivian forces with assistance from the CIA. Even today, Che Guevara remains one of the most recognizable political figures in the world. His image appears on shirts, posters, murals, and flags across the globe. Whether viewed as a hero or a villain, his influence on Cuba and world history is impossible to ignore. To understand why so many Cubans supported Castro's revolution, we need to talk about Havana before 1959. During the 1940s and 1950s, Havana became a playground for wealthy tourists, celebrities, gamblers, and organized crime figures from the United States. American Mafia leaders invested heavily in casinos, hotels, nightclubs, and entertainment venues throughout Cuba. Some of the most famous organized crime figures of the era, including Meyer Lansky, saw Cuba as a major business opportunity. Luxury casinos attracted visitors from around the world. Money flowed into Havana, but many ordinary Cubans saw a different reality. While tourists enjoyed luxury hotels and casinos, large portions of the population remained poor. Critics argue that corruption had become deeply embedded in the political system. Many Cubans believe that Batista government was allowing foreign interests and organized crime to profit while ordinary citizens struggled. When Fidel Castro launched his revolution, one of his promises was to end corruption and reclaim Cuba from outside influence. After taking power in 1959, Castro shut down casinos, nationalized many businesses, and forced organized crime figures out of the country. For many supporters, this was seen as a victory against corruption. For investors, business owners, and criminal organizations that had operated in Cuba, it represented the loss of millions of dollars. The revolution had changed Cuba forever. As tensions increased, Castro turned to the Soviet Union. The Cold War was already underway. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing for influence around the world. To Washington, having a Soviet ally only 90 miles from Florida represented a major security threat. To Cuba, the Soviet Union offered protection, trade, and economic support. The stage was set for one of the most dangerous periods in world history. In 1961, the CIA backed a group of Cuban exiles in an attempt to overthrow Castro. The invasion became known as the Bay of Pigs. The operation failed. The invading force was quickly defeated. For Castro, this confirmed his belief that the United States intended to remove him from power. For the United States, it was a major embarrassment. Trust between the two countries collapsed even further. 1 year later, the conflict became even more dangerous. American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba. Those missiles could potentially strike major American cities within minutes. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. Eventually, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles. The United States promised not to invade Cuba. The immediate crisis ended. The hostility did not. Following the missile crisis, the United States maintained economic sanctions against Cuba. These restrictions eventually became known as the Cuban embargo. Supporters argue that sanctions were necessary to pressure the Cuban government. Critics argue that sanctions hurt ordinary Cubans more than political leaders. For decades, the embargo became one of the most controversial policies in the Western Hemisphere. Fast forward to today, Cuba is experiencing one of the most difficult periods since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The country faces fuel shortages, food shortages, medicine shortages, blackouts, economic stagnation, and mass migration. Many Cubans spend hours searching for basic necessities. Entire communities have experienced extended power outages. Hospitals, schools, and businesses have struggled with unreliable electricity. The Cuban government blames U.S. sanctions and recent fuel restrictions. Critics argue that the decades of economic mismanagement and central planning have also contributed to the crisis. The debate continues. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the tightening of restrictions on fuel shipments to Cuba. The Trump administration increased pressure on companies and countries supplying fuel to the island. As a result, Cuba has struggled to secure enough fuel to operate power plants, transportation networks, and key industries. Supporters of the policy argue that pressure is needed to force political and economic reform. Opponents argue that ordinary Cuban citizens are paying the highest price. This is one of the most emotional and controversial parts of the debate. There is little dispute that shortages have affected daily life. The real argument centers on why. Supporters of the Cuban government argue that sanctions and fuel restrictions contribute directly to suffering and prevent access to critical supplies. Critics argue that the Cuban government uses sanctions as an excuse for problems caused by its own policies. Regardless of where someone stands politically, millions of Cubans continue to face significant hardships. Recently, Donald Trump made headlines with comments suggesting the United States could take a much tougher approach toward Cuba. His administration has openly discussed increasing pressure on Havana and encouraging political change. Supporters see this as leverage. Critics view it as escalating tensions during an already severe crisis. The comments sparked strong reactions both inside Cuba and throughout Latin America. Cuban leaders responded aggressively. President Miguel Diaz-Canel accused Washington of attempting to force regime change through economic pressure. The Cuban government insists that sovereignty is non-negotiable. At the same time, officials have been searching for alternatives. Cuba had expanded efforts to attract foreign investment, increase tourism, develop renewable energy, and strengthen relationships with countries such as China, Russia, and other international partners. Despite all the tension, both sides have recently signaled a willingness to talk. Discussions have reportedly included energy issues, migration, economic concerns, humanitarian matters, regional stability. The United States want reforms and greater freedoms. Cuba wants sanctions relief and access to trade and fuel. Neither side has announced a final agreement, but the fact that discussions are happening at all is significant. Several possibilities exist. Sanctions could remain in place, negotiations could produce limited agreements, or both countries could move toward a gradual normalization of relations. The outcome could affect millions of people on both sides of the Florida Straits. The story of Cuba and the United States is about much more than politics. It is a story of revolution, Cold War rivalry, economic pressure, national sovereignty, and ordinary people trying to build better lives. Today, Cuba faces one of the most difficult moments in its modern history. Whether the future brings confrontation or cooperation may depend on what happens in the negotiations taking place right now. What do you think? Should sanctions be lifted? Should pressure continue? And what kind of future do you see for Cuba? Let me know in the comments.
I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation.